Good afternoon, friends. We are now playing ICI Moto song. I request all participants to put their right hand on their hearts. Now, I request Chairman CA Fenil Shah to address the gathering under whose leadership we all are able to unlock our minds and able to hear on different new topics. Fenil Shah.
Thank you, Vishen Bhai. The speaker for the day, CA Drashti Desai, the Regional Council Member, WRC, the Chairman of Women Empowerment Committee, the Chairperson of Women Empowerment Committee, CA Anjali Choksi, the Secretary of Branch, CA Vishen Shah, and all the members attending this webinar to discuss the nitty-gritties associated with Draft Valuation Bills 2020. Friends, before we start with the session, at the outset, I would like to wish a happy Gujarat Day. And also, as Trustee Madam is here, I would also like to wish happy Maharashtra Day today, being the 1st May 2020. And friends, before we move ahead, I have two small announcements with respect to with members. The very first is today morning you would have received the newsletter of our branch by email, by SMS, and also by WhatsApp. So kindly go through that newsletter. This time it's a complete compilation of all the webinars we have done, the complete PPTs, the working notes being taken during the seminar, and also the FAQs with respect to that are there in that newsletter. Also, if you have missed any of the webinar, you can access the YouTube video links from that particular newsletter. So take the utmost benefit of the same. And also, friends, when we talk of investments, right? If we or our clients have done an investment, we have a very pertinent question that post COVID-19, what will be the situation of investments already done? And many of our clients might also be approaching to us that after lockdown, which will be the avenues where we can do investment. To have the answers to all these questions, tomorrow evening we are having a panel discussion from reputed panelists from Ahmedabad. One is from real estate, another is from gold and gems, and the third is from stock market. So it will be in a very our Ahmedabadi language, our local micro level problems we'll discuss in that. And by getting insights from that, you can also get an idea and you can provide more insights to your clients also. So I would request to take an utmost benefit of this particular webinar. It will be live on radio channels also tomorrow evening at 4 p.m. With this brief words, and also after this we are having a webinar on independent directors also today itself. So with this brief word, I again welcome the speaker of the day, Drashti Madam, and now I request the chairperson of Women Empowerment Committee to introduce the faculty.
Thank you, Chairman CA Fenil Shah, Secretary CA Vishen Shah. A very good afternoon, expert faculty for the webinar, CA Drashti Desai, and my dear CA members. A very important discussion today. MCA under the Committee of Experts had submitted this report to Government of India on 31st March, along with this Draft Valuers Bill 2020, by recommending to establish a National Institute of Valuers. So today's discussion is very important. The public comments are invited till 14th May. So I would request all Ahmedabad members to send their suggestions to the email ID of Ahmedabad branch by 10th May, so that we will compile it and send it to the Government of India. Glad to introduce my friend CA Drashti Desai. She's the RCM in Western WRC. She's a partner with Bansi Mehta and Company, a very leading firm of chartered accountant. And nobody can take a session better than her because she's a valuation expert, having a broad experience in corporate restructuring with specialization in the areas of business valuation like Tata Chemicals, Tata Global Beverages, Idea Vodafone merger, ABNL Grasim, sale of undertakings from MAC. She's also an expert in valuation of intangibles, advisory in the field of mergers, acquisition, spin-off, restructuring, family settlement, and due diligence. Without taking much time, I would request CA Drashti Desai to take the session further. Thank you and wish you all happy learning.
Thank you, Anjali Ben, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Chairman, for inviting me for this session. I think that's the need of the hour today to discuss the bill before us, and we have limited time for giving our inputs. And so I think if we cannot change much, that is at least the advent of the bill, at least we can give our inputs to make it more viable and palatable for practicing valuers. So I have a small presentation on this, and I would like to share my presentation.
Yes, it's shared, ma'am.
Okay.
Now you can start.
Okay. Because I am not getting that screen on my. Okay, so here we are. We have the draft valuation bill 2020. We can give our inputs till 15th of 14th of May. And so it's limited time, and this lockdown and with lots of compliances already on our heads, I think it's a good thing to just quickly brush through all the provisions which have been introduced in this bill. And let's take a call on what really needs to be represented on. So now let's look at the scope. The scope is to over the entire country, and it shall come into force on such date as the central government may by notification appoint for this. Now it is also provided that different provisions can be brought in or made effective on different dates, which is often the case with many laws. And the interesting part here is that there will be a reauthorization act of this valuation act every 10th year on a continuing basis. And in case if the reauthorization does not happen, then the act as prevailing on the date will continue to be in force. So that's a new kind of provision which is there. Now, I think this is a question that all of us would have. What services would be covered under this new bill? When we look at the registered valuers rules, it is very clear that they only apply to the valuations which are done under the Companies Act. Whereas when we look at the definition of valuation services which is given under this bill, valuation bill, we find that valuations for various assets and liabilities which are carried out under the provisions of the Banking Act, SEBI, SERA, Wealth Tax, Income Tax, SARFAESI, means whatever valuations are required under any law prevailing right now are all meant to be done under the provisions of the Valuation Act. Now, one would say that this is a provision under this act, this bill, and so how will that make a difference to the other laws? Yes, there is a disjunct, because until the time the other laws are amended to refer to valuation done by a valuer under the Valuation Act, it is possible that somebody can interpret, and the laws may require that valuation is done by a chartered accountant also, or a merchant banker also, as well as a valuation valuer as per the Valuation Act. But the question that arises, as we will go along and you'll see, the question that arises is that if a person carries out any valuation under any of these laws, does it automatically fall under this law, and so he could not have carried out that valuation, not being a valuer as registered under the Valuation Act? Now, there has to be some clarity that we need on this particular part. Insofar as the Companies Act is concerned, now the Companies Act is also getting amended. So wherever there's a reference to registered valuer, the reference is changed to valuer as per the Valuers Act 2020. And so at least the Companies Act is getting aligned, but the other laws will need to be further aligned. And there is anyway a section in this bill that the provisions of this bill will prevail notwithstanding anything else contained in any other law. However, if the other law requires valuation to be done by a chartered accountant or a merchant banker or whatever other category is defined over there, then one has to do a valuation under that category and also give a report under this law. So there has to be some alignment. I think some clarity requires to be given on this front. Now we look at what is the definition of service provider. A service provider is a valuer professional organization, and a valuer institute. These three are defined as service provider under the valuation bill. The definition of service provider is relevant because later on when we look at the other provisions of investigations and inspection and appeal, this becomes very relevant. Now, briefly, we will just look at what is the framework of NIV. I will not spend too much time on the details of the framework and details of the committee too much because there's a lot of discussion which has to happen on the other provisions where I think one would need to really understand more, and so that would help us even in making representation if that is required. So let's briefly look at what is really NIV. So NIV will be appointed by the central government, and it will be a body corporate. And till the time the NIV is established, IBBI will continue to act as NIV. So there's a transitional provision which is made so that there is no, teething problems while the provision of the statute are still being enacted. Okay, so now what is the function of NIV? It's very important to understand this, that what is really the scope of, this NIV. So NIV is to promote the development of the profession and market for valuation services. One very clear message which was always given along was that they wanted more competition in this field of valuation. The other thing is to regulate the profession of valuers and the market for valuation services. And the third is to protect the interest of users of valuation services. So this is the basic objective. Now let's look at what is the framework of NIV. So there is going to be a governing council, and there will be a chairman of the governing council, and there will be a committee of valuers, there will be audit committee, valuation standards committee. And there is going to be an administrative law department. Now this ALM or ALD as we are referring here is a very important department because all the litigations and appeals and orders in fact will be all passed by the ALM or the panels under ALD. So this is a very important department, and one can see that I have not kept it under the governing council because ALD is really not directed by the governing council. ALD independently functions. Although the appointment of ALM, that administrative law member who heads the ALD, is to be done initially by the governing council. We will come to the detail of ALD a little bit in a little while. Right now, let's just look at what is a valuation standard committee's role. So there will be a valuation standard committee which will look at the existing which will prescribe the standards, review the standards, and recommend the standards. This is what is the role of valuation standard committee. I have covered a little more in detail about the committee of valuers because it is quite important to see the role of committee of valuers because they are the ones who really know what valuation is all about. Now coming to ALD. So as you can see on the screen, ALD has to be constituted under the supervision of ALM, that is Administrative Law Member. There will be Administrative Law Officers and NIV will designate as many officers as required to work in this particular department. Now let's look at what is the eligibility criteria for an Administrative Law Officer. So he has to have degree in law, 5 years experience as law officer or teacher in law in recognized university. So basically he has to be completely from a legal background. The administrative law member shall constitute one or more panels from the administrative law officers. You will wonder why am I taking you so much in depth? You'll understand this a little bit in detail as we go along. Why it is important to understand the constitution of this department, because I would say that this administrative law department and the panels constituted under that are in a way akin to the tribunals, maybe the income tax tribunals. I won't say they are exactly the same. We will see why. But one can say they are akin to that, and that is why it is important to understand that here the panels will constitute of only law officers. So people who only have background in law will constitute the panels. Now, when we just understand as to what is the constitution in case of tribunals, benches, you will note that there is one judicial member and there is one accountant member. And the reason why they have that is because to understand Income Tax Act also, you need to have someone who has good knowledge of understanding financials, and there is another member who will just look at the questions of law. So here both or I don't know what will be the strength of each panel, but each panel will be only comprising of administrative law officers. Now there is one interesting caveat here, that no officer or employee of administrative law department shall deal with a matter which he dealt with while working in another department of NIV. Clearly, this is to avoid any conflict, because if he's the one who has passed the order as maybe an inspector or in some other capacity, then he cannot decide on the matter where he himself has been involved in a particular matter. Now we come to the functions of the Committee of Valuers. You can see that the Committee of, so there are going to be 20 members in the Committee of Valuers, and 15 will be appointed by VPOs, that is a Valuation Professional Organization, and 5 members will be appointed by the NIV itself. Now, what is the role of Committee of Valuers? We should understand this. So, Committee of Valuers will meet from time to time, and they may advise NIV on its own or on reference from NIV. So there might be some issues which the Committee of Valuers may think are relevant to be brought up to NIV, and so they may decide, and they might on their own discuss that and advise NIV, or there may be a reference which might be made by NIV, and Committee of Valuers has to ponder over the issues under the reference and advise the NIV on the issues. Now, whatever advice is given by the Committee of Valuers, it will be considered by the council. So it has to be considered by the council. And there is one interesting requirement, that every advice of the Committee of Valuers and the decision of the council shall be published in public domain. So if there is some recommendation or some advice which goes from the committee of valuers, then the council, then the NIV has to appropriately deal with and has to even publish whatever has been the decision taken. So this is a good transparency which has been brought in this statute. Now we come to the area which really interests us as valuers. So we come to this, what are the classes of valuers which are recognized under this bill? So there is a classification of valuation entities which can be a valuer. There can be associate valuers, fellow valuers, and honorary valuers. Now let's look at each of this. So if you see anybody who is eligible under 49, section 49, which is the eligibility criteria for becoming a valuer, will be registered with NIV as an associate valuer. So it is akin to what we have under our CA regulations, where when you become a member, you become an associate, and then you become fellow after 5 years. So similarly here, a fellow valuer is a person who has been an associate valuer with NIV for 5 or more years. And the other condition that has to be complied with here is that he has to also demonstrate that he has exercised professional excellence of high order. Now that is a little subjective thing, but I think anybody who has not violated any of the conditions or any of the regulations, I'm sure would be considered as someone who has exercised professional excellence of high order. Now we have another category, the fourth category of honorary valuer. And what is the requirement to become honorary valuer? That person should have given extraordinary contribution to the valuation profession, which means that he need not be really an associate member who is eligible under section 49, although or a fellow valuer, which he would become once he's a 5 years into registration. An honorary valuer need not be eligible under 49. So you may have a person who really is not eligible, but he will become an honorary valuer if he has made some extraordinary contribution to the valuation profession. And that person who is designated as an honorary valuer will not render any valuation service. Clearly, this is to safeguard that in case if there's someone who is not really qualified under or eligible under section 49 and he becomes a valuer and an honorary valuer, then of course one has to ensure that such a person does not render valuation services. Now, the interesting thing here is that because there is a restriction that an honorary valuer cannot render valuation services, no valuer who is in active practice and even after he has become fellow or even if he's contributed extraordinarily to the profession, he would not opt to become honorary valuer. Now let's look at what is the process of registration. So first of all, the person who wants to register under the Act has to be eligible under section 49. We'll come to all those conditions of 49 a little later. He has to be a member of a VPO and he has to make an application in an appropriate form with fee. Now, the question that will arise now is that who are the VPOs? You know, whether our existing RVO, where you are a member, will be recognized as a VPO. And yes, there is a provision under the bill which says that all the VPOs which are registered under the Registered Valuers rules under the Companies Act will automatically be recognized as VPOs under the Valuation Act. So there is a transition which is provided. Now, if again after this, the NIV has to make inquiry whether the person should be registered. Okay, and there is another savings provision which is there for especially interesting registered valuers, that a valuer who is registered under the registered valuers rules will be deemed to be an associate valuer from the date of registration under Companies Act, which means that if you have already got registered right in the beginning, you already have spent more than 1 year as a registered valuer under the RVR, then you will be an associate valuer under the Valuation Act, and your 1 year will be counted from the date of your, because that's the period you have spent as a registered valuer. So that is again another transitional provision which has been provided here. Now, in case if there's a rejection by NIV from registering someone, then there has to be adequate opportunity which has to be given to the applicant whose application is rejected. Now let's look at what are the conditions under section 49. So let's first come to the educational qualifications which are required. So we have first of all a new program which is a national valuation program, which is if you have done 12 and you do a national valuation program, which is a full-fledged program of 4 years, then you are qualified. There are other conditions also which have to be satisfied, but at least this condition on education is something that you will qualify under. There is another program which is called the Graduation Valuation Program, which is also a full-fledged course, which is a 2-year course which has to be completed after graduation, and one has to have a degree in relevant, field which is specified. The third and the fourth classification, you can see I have noted at the bottom of the slide that this is available for 2 years, the fourth one is available for 3 years. And this is clearly for transition, because once the enactment happens, it will take time for even rolling out national valuation program or graduation valuation program, because that will be rolled out under various institutes. So first of all, they'll have to enroll or they will have to register institutes, and then they will roll out these programs, national valuation and graduation. So it will all take time, and I think this 2 years and 3 years seem to be for providing for this transition to the new course. So now let's look at what are the transitional provisions. The transitional provision says that the valuer has to pass exam in respective asset class. Now, as I see the bill now, there is no specific understanding that I get from the bill as to what exactly is this valuation examination of respective asset class. It is possible that the registered valuer examination that we have for separate asset classes might be recognized even over here. And I think that would be the best way of transition. And he has to have experience of rendering valuation service for at least 5 years, and has to complete a limited valuation program of specific asset class. Now, this limited valuation program is again a 400 hours program, and that also will be run by the various institutes which will register. We'll just come to all the details of the specific courses, so you will see as to what really is under the various programs which are proposed under the bill. Now we come to the fourth classification, that the valuer should have passed the examination again of respective asset class. My presumption is that that valuation exam would be the existing exam that is recommended under the registered valuers rules, which is conducted by IBBI. Plus, he has to have completed specified hours of training from valuation professional organization. Now, what is that specified hours of training from VPO that we have to see, because for registering as registered valuers, whatever number of hours of training was required to be completed, that is something that we have already complied with as registered valuers. And whether there'll be an extension of that training itself to get registered over here, I think it would be, because there is another transitional provision which is quite important, which I'll bring out to you. And there has to be specific qualification which is given, which is under specific discipline. So now let's come to what are the educational qualifications. As I said, what is National Valuation Program? So in detail, a National Valuation Program is a 4-year full-time course comprising of the following, which will have subject credits common to every asset class and subject credits specific to an asset class and practice credits specific to an asset class. So when somebody enrolls for the National Valuation Program after 12th standard, the program will train and educate the candidates for all the asset class valuations, but there will be specialized training for the specific asset class where he wants to get trained, and also practice credits are required. Next, we come to the Graduate Valuation Program, which is a 2-year full-time course which will comprise of subject credits and specific subject credits, common subject credits, and practice credits. Now, what will be the number of credits and all? That will be something which will be decided by the NIV through the governing council. Then we have the limited valuation program, and this limited valuation program, as I said, as I earlier stated, will be a 400 hours program which will be delivered by a valuer institute, and the syllabus will be also specified by the NIV. Now, what is the meaning of specified discipline? As we saw earlier, in case of a graduate valuation program, the person has to also be a graduate in the specified discipline. And so we are looking at what are the specified disciplines which are approved. So for plant and machinery, you need to be a graduate in mechanical, electronic, communication, instrumentation, and several other engineering lines, plus 5 years of experience in valuing the asset class. In case of postgraduate in valuation of plant and machinery, then 3 years of experience is required. Similarly for land and building. Now we come to financial assets, which are quite relevant for us, since most of us basically focus on registration for financial assets, being chartered accountants. So the person has to be a member of ICAI, ICSI, MBA, postgraduate diploma in business management, or postgraduate in finance, plus a 3 years experience in valuing the asset class. This means that under financial assets, there is no room for a graduate in commerce. It has to be a person who is a member of ICAI, ICSI, MBA. So if we go back to the slide up over here, yes, you can see that degree in equivalent qualification. So there is graduation valuation program which can be done by a chartered accountant. So that means if you want after 3 years to do a valuation, or you want to register as a valuer and you want to go under the graduation valuation program, of course, then you will spend 2 years in doing that full-time course of graduation valuation program, although you are a chartered accountant. And right now you will be able to qualify under the 4th column that I have given over here, which is that you pass the valuation examination, which is anyway given under the registered valuers rules, and completing a certain number of hours of training. So this is how the structure of examination and the education is captured under this act. So on interpreting this further, one can say that going forward, if you decide to do valuation, then even after doing CA, you will still spend 2 more years. And so if you are determined to do valuation only and you want to take up your career as valuer early on in your life, you decide that I want to be a valuer, then one may not do CA and simply join as under the National Valuation Program and need not do CA. Okay. Now we come to ineligible individuals. So under section 49, there is a provision as to which defines as to who are not eligible to be valuers. So an individual who's a minor, who's bankrupt, or who's applied for adjudication as a bankrupt, an individual who is of unsound mind, and who's convicted by a competent court for an offence punishable with imprisonment for a term exceeding 6 months, or for an offence involving moral turpitude for a period of 5 years, and that and a period of 5 years has not elapsed from the expiry or date of expiry of the sentence. So there has to be a cooling period of 5 years. And if an individual is imprisoned for a period of 7 years, then he will not be eligible to be registered at all. I think these are very similar to what we have under the registered valuers rules. The same ineligibilities are also spelled out over here. Another requirement or ineligibility is that the person should not be a non-resident in India. So if a person is a non-resident in India as per FEMA, then he will not be eligible to be a valuer under the Valuation Act. And there is also a criteria of he is not a fit and proper person. Now, if we see, there is a definition of fit and proper person under the Valuation Act, and it says that for determining whether a person is fit and proper, the institute may take into account any consideration as it deems fit, including but not limited to the following: integrity, reputation, character, absence of conviction and restraint orders, and competence, including financial solvency. So one can say that to determine fit and proper, although it says including but not limited to, one can say that it should be somewhere in this range. And so I think the definition of fit and proper has been spelled out. So the presumption of that agis generis has to be extended to the definition of fit and proper. Now we come to the eligibility condition. So we have ineligibility for individuals, and then we have the eligibility conditions for partnership firm or company. So if you see, there's a definition of person. So any person can be a valuer, and in the definition of person, you have, I'll just read out what is the definition of person. And person includes an individual, HUF, society, company, trust, partnership, LLP, university, or any other entity established by central or state statute. So these are persons. So then there is an eligibility condition which is specified for partnership firm or company, and partnership here includes LLP. So the conditions are that it should not be a subsidiary, a joint venture, or associate of another company or a body corporate. Now this condition I think is also there in registered valuers rule. It's a very important condition here. Now the second thing is that it says that primary objective is to provide valuation services. Now what do you mean by primary objective? Does it mean that it has to be incorporated with the object, the main object of rendering valuation services? So there was a little ambiguity earlier under the registered values rule. So I think here there's a very clear provision which says that at least 50% of the revenue should be derived from valuation services. In that case, it would be deemed that the primary objective is to provide valuation services. Now, one question here is that if you have just started a partnership firm or an LLP, specifically for just registering under this Valuation Act, then you don't have any last previous year's revenue benchmark of 50%. And so how does the institute view this kind of a situation where there is no, past, track record of 50% revenue? So it will then have to be viewed as, at least in the year in which it is, if it is the first year, then the year of registration, it should not have less than 50%. So there needs to be a little more clarity on what is the meaning of primary objective and that 50% revenue derived from validation services. Not undergoing insolvency resolution, that's similar to the registered valuers rules. None of the partners or directors are ineligible under section 49(2). That is the ineligibility criteria that we just discussed earlier. So none of the partners or directors should be ineligible under that. Majority of, now this is also a very interesting condition. Majority of the partners or directors and whole-time directors are valuers holding COP. So if we just compare this with the existing provisions of the registered valuers rules, it said that at least 3 partners or directors should be, registered valuers. So there's a departure from there, and you need to have majority of the partners who should be holding COP, partners or directors holding COP. And one interesting and one, in fact, it's a welcome change, that earlier it required that all the partners should be eligible to be registered, which would mean that was there in the registered valuers rules, and that was creating a lot of it's creating a lot of confusion whether all the partners need to pass the exam of registered valuers, or is it that they should not be ineligible. And here it is, I think, quite clearly defined that they should not be ineligible under section 49(2), and these are the criteria. So I think this ambiguous condition has been done away with in this act. None of the partners, now this condition is also very important to note, that none of the partners or directors should be a partner or director of another partnership or company which is a valuer. So you cannot have multiple entities where you can be partners or directors. So this is clearly to ensure that there are no professional valuers who become members or they become directors on boards of various companies, so that the eligibility criteria can be met. So this is a condition I see is for that purpose. The last condition is at least one of its partners or directors should be a valuer of the asset class for which the partnership firm or the company is seeking registration. This is fine. Okay, so we saw that the first condition was that the company should not be a subsidiary or a joint venture of another company. However, if you see section 49(4), there is a provision that the institute, that is NIV, may register as a valuer a multidisciplinary firm, but that would be with caution, and or a subsidiary of or a joint venture or associate of another company or body corporate. So there is a window which is kept open for registering subsidiary, JV, or associate of other company, but how that will have to be exercised with safeguards. Now, what is the meaning of multidisciplinary firm? Because as chartered accountants, I think we would be interested in knowing whether our firms can get registration as registered valuer firms, or valuer firms. So multidisciplinary firm means a partnership firm formed by different professions to carry out multidisciplinary practice, which means that when my partnership firm has 50% of partners who are registered under the Act as valuers and 50% who are not, then it will be a multidisciplinary firm, and I will be able to register that multidisciplinary firm. But we have to see as to what are the safeguards and what are the other criteria that are pronounced by the NIV or the government. Now, there's a clarification here that a firm which is formed by valuers from different asset classes is not a multidisciplinary firm. So this is one. So it promotes, firms where there are valuers from different asset classes who are all partners, which means that there would be other than CA firms, and there'll be pure valuation firms which will now come up. Now, this is condition as to continuing registration. So this is something which is also there under the registered valuers rule, and this is to comply with applicable provisions of the rules and regulations. You have to file your disclosures. You have to do your continuing professional education, abide by the code of conduct, adequate steps to be taken for redressal of grievances, and maintain records of all assignments for such period as may be required. Now let's see what is a COP under the proposed bill. So what is the importance of COP? So a person can render valuation service only in accordance with the conditions of COP granted, and only if a person is holding a COP that he can render valuation services. And the other condition which one has to keep in mind is that a valuer shall not be eligible to hold COP if he is in employment. And however, there is a carve out here, because otherwise, if a whole-time director is also considered to be a person in employment, then there can be some issues in registering a company because you have to meet with that 50% director's criteria. So there is a carve out which is provided here that in case of a company, a whole-time director is not considered to be a person in employment. So here are some conditions how valuation should be conducted by a valuer. So one is that you have to comply with the valuation standard. Now it's very important to look at what are the conditions, which I think just running into one slide. A valuer should not outsource valuation service to another person, that is, use third party to render valuation services required from him. It's very important that whatever is required out of a valuer cannot be outsourced to a third person and then you give a certificate based on that. A valuer may seek opinion from an expert or get a valuation conducted by another valuer for an asset class for which he is not registered. So the earlier condition really doesn't come in the way if I don't have the qualification to carry out valuation of a particular asset class, or I don't have the qualification required to assess a particular, area, and so I can rely on an expert's opinion or valuation of the asset class from another valuer, and so that is permitted. However, if we see the next condition, it says the valuer shall be deemed to be responsible for the opinion or valuation received. So it means that the valuer will be held responsible for even if there is any non-compliance or there is some lacuna in the valuation of the valuation done by the valuer of the other asset class on which he is relying. Now, when we see that this particular condition, when we say that the other asset class has to be valued by the valuer who has got the proficiency to do that valuation, he also would be registered under the Act. So here we are looking at a situation where there will be a dual liability. Now we come to the next condition of conducting. A valuation report shall not carry any disclaimer or condition which has potential to dilute the responsibility of the valuer. So this is something which is also there in the existing law under registered valuers rules. So there is a similar requirement. This is extended here also. A valuer shall not conduct a valuation where he has conflict of interest. And lastly, a valuer shall not charge a fee which is linked to the value of assets under valuation or success of the relevant transaction. Now, this is on valuation standards, because till the time valuation standards are notified by the NIV, international valuation standards can be adopted, or evaluation standards as adopted by the VPO, where the valuer is a member, will be followed. Now, what these are now quite important to understand what are contraventions by a valuer, because there are contraventions which are given in the schedule. I'm only listing down contraventions given in first schedule and second schedule because that is for valuers, and the third and the fourth schedule contraventions are relevant only for valuation professional organizations. So now let's look at what are the contraventions that we should be wary of. Renders services without a valid COP, pays share commission brokerage in fee or profit from profession. So if you're paying any commission or share or brokerage or fee from this valuation profession to someone, then that is also a contravention. Except profit from professional work of a non-valuer person, that is also a contravention. Whether so that means in general conduct, if there is any sharing arrangement for any work, unless that is done for professional work and that is done either under the Valuers Act or it is done under a multidisciplinary firm, if there is any contravention by way of acceptance of profit, there is a violation. And the violations have very serious consequences, as we'll come to later. Secures professional business through services of another person who's not an employee, partner, or director. Solicits client unfairly, unethically by advertisement. So no advertisement. Advertises professional attainment. That is also not permitted. Charges or offers to charge a fee as percentage of profit based on or based on finding. This is not permitted. Engages in business or occupation of other than valuer unless permitted. So now this is a very interesting, disqualification. So if you are also as an individual, you are registered as a valuer, and you are also partner in another CA firm, and you are also practicing tax, then whether that will be permitted is something which we will have to see. I think there has to be some leeway which has to be given here, because as we know that valuation may not have that much work as to keep somebody occupied for the whole time, and so other occupation may also be required. Allows a person not being a partner or director to sign valuation report. Does not supply information called for or comply with the requirements asked by the panel. Now, this is something which flows from the investigation and the inspection provisions which are provided, which I've discussed in detail a little later. So, if he does not supply information, then also he is in contravention of the first schedule. He fails to submit information in timely manner. That is also a contravention. Gives false information in advertisement or against tenders or inquiries. Fails to inform NIV of ineligibility under section 49. So after he is registered, he develops some ineligibility, then it is his duty to inform the institute, the NIV, about the ineligibility. So he fails to inform that. In that case also there is a contravention. There are no, right now, as I could see, the provisions are not very elaborate about, how do you inform about ineligibility and how do you surrender your, COP. So that's something, or registration. So one has to see, because if there is no provision for surrendering and you become ineligible, then how do you avoid this contravention under the first schedule is something which we have to see. In the opinion of NIV, would bring disrepute to the profession. That's another condition. So that's a little bit subjective. Now we come to the second schedule, or the contraventions which are listed in the second schedule. It discloses information of client which is obtained during professional engagement. So you have to keep the information of client confidential. You can't disclose. That's a good thing. Certifies a valuation report not made by the valuer. permits use of his name to vouch for or certify for earnings or estimates contingent upon future. Now, this is very important. As a valuer, you cannot use or you cannot allow use of your name to certify estimates which are contingent upon future, which means if you are certifying uh, if you're certifying the projection, then that may not be permitted. However, as we know, as chartered accountants, we do give that there is a process under which the projections are certified by a chartered accountant when it comes to raising finance. So how this contravention will have to be read with that function, we have to see. I am of the view that this should not be extended beyond the valuations which are conducted by the valuer. It should not go beyond the valuation work which is conducted. So if he is certifying the estimates or projections for the valuation which he has conducted, then there could be considered as contravention of the condition in second schedule, but not otherwise. Now let's see, there has to be some clarification on this. He expresses opinion on valuation of an enterprise where he or his partner or a director has substantial interest. So if you are an interested party, you should not in any way, normally also when there's a conflict of interest, to ensure there is independence, one should anyway not express an opinion in such situations. He fails to disclose in the report material fact known to him uh, that has bearing on valuation. Now, when as valuers, you would know that there are so many assumptions, so much of information that we obtain in the process of doing valuation, and it is possible that some information, quite a bit of this information would be confidential in nature, and that information, like for example detailed projections which are given by a company which has very detailed plans and utilization of capacity and rollouts and various things, and pricing and everything. So that those projections would be given to a valuer, because without that, how would the valuer, verify whether the projections are really something which he can rely on? But uh, and it does have a very important bearing on valuation. Now, does it mean that he has to disclose the projections which are given, or does it mean that he simply has to make a disclosure that there are these future projections which are given and he's relying on those projections which are confidential in nature? I think we need some clarity on this particular aspect also. Then we have failure to report material misstatement known to him in the report. That's very interesting condition when I read this condition, that if there is a material misstatement and it is known to the valuer, then how would a valuer certify a value? So I don't know how to give meaning to this. At least I don't think I would be able to certify a valuation or certify a report of valuation if I knew there was a misstatement in the projections or some financial information given to me. Uh, and then you have, he does not exercise due diligence or is grossly negligent. So please note it is not just negligent, it is grossly negligent. So that is quite, it's a good thing that it is only grossly negligent which is mentioned here. There's one whole page of still further, contravention which we have to keep in mind. He fails to invite attention to material departure from generally accepted procedures. Now, this is also very interesting because normally, as valuers, you would know that there are certain valuation methods that adopt in valuing certain types of assets or certain types of businesses. Now, if you are making a departure from the normally accepted procedure or method, does it need to be brought out here along with the reason for that? one has to see. And in any case, I think in good order, one should write as to why are the reasons why certain approaches are not adopted. But anyway, one has to have some clarity on what is the meaning of material departure from generally accepted procedures. So procedures, whether procedures will include methods, one has to see. Then contravenes any of the provisions of the Act and regulations, contravenes bylaws or ethical code issued by VPO. In fact, when you say contravention of any provision of the Act or regulation, the bylaws and all are anyway issued by the VPO under the Act only. So automatically this is also covered. Being an employee discloses confidential information he was privy to. This is a very welcome provision, because it should not be that only the valuers, the registered valuers are uh, the people who are signing the report should be bound by the confidentiality clause, but it should be also the employees who are involved in evaluation who should be bound by the confidentiality clause. And so there's a good provision. Submits information forms, return statements knowing them to be false. So makes a false declaration. And he's ineligible under section 49 and still renders service. So that's a very serious offense. And violates conditions of registration under section 50, subsection 6, which is the continuing conditions of registration. So now we've finished with the contraventions, the list of contraventions, and now we come to something which is quite new, it's novel to this law. So there are, if you see in this bill, there's a provision for inspection and investigation of a service provider. Now you saw in the definition, service provider means valuer, VPOs and valuer institutes. So all are covered under this. So there is a provision for inspection of service provider. Now let us see what really triggers an inspection of service provider. These are very important provisions and one must, pay a lot of attention to this. So there is a provision which says under section 31(1), it says that there will be routine inspection of cases selected every year based on certain criteria. The NIV will, select certain number of cases every year for whom a routine inspection will be carried out. And there will be another situation where the NIV has received a complaint under section 30, and under that complaint there is information, or the NIV has material available on record, and based on these two things or any of those things, NIV has reasonable ground to believe that the service provider is in violation of the Act, rules, regulations, or directions. In that case, there can be an inspection which can be triggered under subsection 2 of section 31. So what is the purpose of inspection under section 31(2)? So when we see the first criteria, which is, I think it looks more like a peer review, which is done by our Institute of Chartered Accountants, where there are certain number of cases which are selected, and there is a peer review and the quality review which is done by the institute. So this seems to be similar, where there are certain number of cases which are selected by the NIV every year, and what will be the purpose of that inspection? So the purpose is to ensure that the records are maintained by SP, that is service provider. It is to ascertain that the internal controls are maintained. Now, when I look at the present bill, I do not see anything about the internal controls, but under the regulations, the governing council can come up with several items, and I think internal controls can be one of them. And so one has to see as to what are the internal controls which are required to be maintained. Clearly, that will be to support the objective, I think, of confidentiality and several other things. We have to see as to what internal controls finally get defined. The third condition is if the service provider is unfit or ineligible for the valuation. So that would have to be material on record that the service provider is not fit or is ineligible. Then we have other two purposes of inspection which are a little bit intriguing to me. And they are to ascertain if the service provider has complied with the statutory requirements or inquire into information received from complainant. Now, when we look at the earlier slide, it says that the NIV has to have reasonable ground to believe that the service provider is in violation. Now, when we come to the second slide, the next slide, it says that it can be to ascertain. The purpose of inspection is to ascertain if the service provider has complied with the statutory requirements, which means that there may not be enough evidence on record, and through inspection, the NIV or the inspecting authority will ascertain whether the service provider has complied with the statutory requirements or not. However, there is kind of a contradiction that I see under the provisions that trigger inspection and the purpose of inspection. So ideally, purpose of inspection cannot overstep the the trigger for inspection. So this is the process of initiating inspection. So NIV has reasonable ground to believe that the inspection is necessary. So that can be out of the routine inspection requirements or inspection based on information for violation. And for the above, the NIV has to have material on record. Now, this is very important to note. There has to be material on record. Now, one can take analogy from the decisions which are rendered under other laws. What is the meaning of material on record? And I think there has to be compliance of those conditions. When you say material on record, there will have to be a process which will be followed by the governing council to initiate inspection. Now, what will be, and then after the material is there on record with NIV, NIV has to pass an order for inspection. So this is the order which will give the authority to the inspecting authority. So now what will be there in the order? The order will define what is the scope for inspection. We have to see as time goes by as to what exactly will be, how will the scope be defined. There will have to be timeline which has to be specified in the inspection. So that means there is flexibility given to NIV in defining the timeline for inspection. There is the order also has to specify what is the composition of the inspecting team, and it has to specify if a progress report or an interim report has to be submitted, or inspection report has to be submitted. So this is what has to be there in the inspection order, which will have to be passed by the NIV. Now we come to how is the process of conducting inspection. So under this, first of all, there has to be a service of notice which has to be given 10 days in advance to the service provider. However, there is a power to dispense with this notice if there is reasonable ground to believe that there will be a delay in the process. Records might get destroyed or mutilated, basically compromised, if a notice is given. So in such cases only, there is a power to dispense with the notice. Now, the service provider may be asked to submit information before commencement of inspection. So that means you will have a notice which will be issued, which will say that in 10 days time, the inspection will begin. And the service provider may be asked to submit information before commencement of inspection. So now this is a slight, difficult situation, because if the service provider is asked to submit information before commencement of inspection, then the notice period will lose its relevance. And so one has to actually see or define as to in what situation can and what kind of information can be asked to be submitted. So there should be some sort of a guideline given on what information can at best be asked to be submitted before commencement of inspection. Then there is a provision that the inspecting authority may visit the service provider or its associate's office for on-site inspection. So now for a valuer to have an on-site inspection is a little bit of a foreign thought because what is going to be in inspection ultimately it is not that a valuer is going to hide some assets with him. So generally an inspection on site is done under different laws when they need to find some assets or they find some documents. In case of a valuer, one has to understand as to what is the trigger for an on-site inspection. Then the valuer, the service provider, has to provide records to the authority in the course of inspection, and the authority, the inspecting authority, can retain these documents for up to 6 months. The other thing that inspecting authority can do during the inspection is that it can record statement of the associate during inspection. Now, interestingly, I noted that it only says that the statement of an associate can be recorded during inspection. It doesn't say that the statement of the service provider can be recorded during inspection. So one has to understand exactly what is the thought behind this. And then after this process of inspection is done, then there will be a submission of either interim or final report to NIV by the inspecting authority. So I have now next dealt with what is the interim inspection report, and this is provided in the section 33 of the bill. Okay, so when does the inspecting authority submit an interim inspection report? That is when he finds it appropriate on his own to submit the interim inspection report, or is required by the institute to submit the interim inspection report. Inspecting authority submits the report, and the NIV, if is satisfied that there is a gross contravention of the provision, then there will be a reference at this stage itself, which will be made to the ALN. So you can note this over here that there is no order or there is no step which is taken by NIV. The reference is only made to ALM for appropriate action. Now ALM will then issue a notice to SP to represent, and there are this notice can be dispensed with in exceptional situations, which I think should be similar to the dispensation conditions which would be required for the inspection notice. Then the ALM has to pass an order after ALM receives the submission. The ALM has to pass an order to the following effect, which is to cease or desist suspension of certificate of registration of SP for a period not exceeding 90 days, or impose such conditions or restrictions which are considered appropriate. Now, you may note that at this stage, to the best of my reading, I could not see any scope for order disposing the case without any action at this stage. Because of this, the ALM has to pass an order of one of the three categories which are specified. So I think C is quite a wide category, and there can be order which could be passed under C category. Interim order will lapse in 90 days. So the interim inspection order will have life of only 90 days, and that is why if you see the suspension of certificate of registration is only for 90 days. Now we come to inspection report. So how does the inspecting authority make the inspection report? So first of all, he'll make the draft inspection report. We'll send it to the service provider and give 15 days time to revert will send it to also NIV. And what will NIV do to this? NIV will then look at the report and suggest if there's any further inspection required or whether the inspection is satisfactorily concluded. And once it receives this direction from NIV and receives the input from the service provider, then the inspecting authority has to pass an inspection order, which has to be after considering both the things, which is the advice which is received from NIV, as also what submissions are received from the service provider. So this is about the inspection report. Now we come to the second part. So I'll deal with this a little later as to what then happens to the inspection report. So now we come to the investigation part. Now investigation is it's similar to inspection. Only thing is, in case of investigation is based on, again, information received from a complainant or the service provider. There is NIV has material on record to show or to believe, not show, to have reasonable ground to suspect that the service provider is in violation. Now note this, that over here the words are to suspect, whereas in case of inspection the words are to believe. So there has to be, in case of inspection, there has to be reasonable ground to believe that SP is in violation, whereas in case of investigation, there has to be reasonable ground to suspect that SP is in violation. Now, this is a slightly wider term which is used over here, that is suspect. But one can say that even for suspicion, there has to be material available on record, or there has to be information which is received from complainant, which means that an investigation cannot be for just fishing inquiry. Okay, so this is the trigger for investigation. Now we come to the process of initiating investigation. So NIV, as we noted, has reason to suspect that investigation is necessary. It has material on record to suspect this, either on its own or by way of information which is filed by a complainant. Again, there has to be an order which has to be passed by NIV to trigger investigation, and the order of investigation has to specify the scope, timeline, composition of investigating team, and progress report, interim report. Now, one can note, I have written one more condition over here, that NIV can expand the scope of the order at any time after recording reasons in writing. So any time means even after the investigation has begun and there is some additional evidence or additional information which comes to its record or it comes to its knowledge, then can you say that it can expand the scope of the order which it has passed earlier under 35(4)? I would say that it would contradict, this kind of situation will contradict with the condition that NIV has to have material on record to suspect that there is a violation. So if it has come across some information after the investigation has begun and due to the investigation process, can that material be used for expanding the scope? One has to see. Now, what is the process of conducting investigation? So here, if you note, it's very similar to the process which is for inspection. Only thing is, over here, the time is shortened. It is 5 days time given to a service provider. And in case of inspection, you have noticed that it is 10 days time which is given to service provider. And the service provider may be asked to submit information, again the same thing, that there should be some guidance as to what information can be asked for before the commencement of the investigation. The investigating team can visit the SP's office or the associate's office for on-site investigation, provide records to the authority. The SP has to provide all the records to the authority, and which will be retained with the investigation authority for 6 months. An investigation authority can record statement of the associate during investigation in relation to the affairs of the service provider. It may be noted that the notes of examination have to be signed off by the associate. So this condition was not there in case of inspection. I think that condition might be missed out there because it is very important to have the signature or the person who has given the statement. Then we have submission of interim or final report. Now we come to the provision of search and seizure. It's a very new provision. So under this law, there is the authority can actually even carry out search and seizure under investigation. So if the investigating authority finds that the records might be hidden somewhere, falsified somewhere, and believes that there can be destruction or mutilation of the record, in that case, there can be search and seizure of any premises where such records are believed to have been hidden. And so this is a very new provision, search and seizure. This is I know time is running out, but there is so much here. In fact, I've cut short my presentation to a great deal. However, I think it's important to just note some very glaring provisions over here. So now we come to the order of court. So there is an order of court which is required for carrying out search and seizure. So first, the investigating authority has to make an application to the court having jurisdiction, and then get an order from the court to carry out search and seizure. So now you have the interim investigation report, which is, I think, on similar lines as the inspection reports. I will not really spend more time on this. Okay, so here we are, investigation report. So if you see this, investigation report will be sent by the investigating authority to the NIV, and NIV will then give an advice. So there is no scope, or there is no room for the service provider to represent on the investigation report. So there is no sharing of investigation draft report with the service provider, and there's no provision to take the service provider cannot give his representation on the draft report. So these are the consequences of failure to comply with investigation. So when there's a failure to, so what are the failures? Very important. So let me just take you through what are the failures. The failures are to produce any book, register, record, or other document, furnish any information, appear or answer any question, sign the notes of any examination. So when we look at the third, non-compliance, which is failure to appear or answer any question. Now, if you have given answer, but the answer is not really to the satisfaction of the investigation officer, will it be considered as failure to answer a question? We don't know really still. One has to have a little more guidance on this particular failure also. This failure will be liable to fine, which can extend to 1 lakh, and also imprisonment of 1 month or both. Now, you may note that this order for fine or imprisonment may not be appealable. Now we come to the process of adjudication of investigation or inspection by NIV. So we have the, so one is that NIV has to expeditiously consider the investigation or the inspection report. And if NIV forms a prima facie opinion that there is sufficient cause to take action, then issue a show cause notice, else it will have to close the case. And when a show cause notice is issued, then along with the show cause notice issued to the service provider, it has to be accompanied by copies of relevant documents, which is all the records collected, investigation report, inspection report, and that has to be served to the service provider by way of post and email. This is specified. and the notice has to get at least 21 days time to respond to the show cause notice. Now, if the notice fails to attend to the show cause notice, then it will be disposed of based on material on record. NIV is to send all the material, including submission of service provider, to the panel. Now comes this question whether NIV passes the order based on what information it gets on the issuance of show cause notice. So we see that after this, at this stop, NIV's role also comes to a stop, and now the institute has to send across all this material to the panel. Now, if you remember, I had discussed earlier that there will be panels which will be comprised of law members, law officers, and the panel will have to then look at all the material which is submitted. And now here, this is a process for disposal of show cause notice by the panel. The panel has to give an opportunity of hearing. So this is principle of natural justice. Panel has to seek. Now, if we note that the panel comprises only law officers, so if this is a matter of valuation, it may not be possible for a legal person really to understand as to what is the violation or what is a non-compliance. And so a panel has a liberty to take opinion of an expert to understand the issue. The panel has to pass a reasoned order within 180 days from the date of issuance of the show cause notice, which is issued by NIV. So now this is a very interesting condition here, that the panel shall not examine the merits of a valuation unless there is a prima facie evidence of mala fide, gross negligence, or willful misconduct. Now this is a good save here, because if there is no evidence, there's no prima facie case which is made out of mala fide, gross negligence, or willful misconduct, then the panel will not get into the merits of a valuation, because valuation is a very subjective field, we all know. And so if somebody has to challenge and challenge the valuation saying that this is not right, unless there is gross negligence, willful misconduct, or an intention to defraud, then the panel will not really examine the merits of valuation. Now, this comes in only when it comes to the panel to examine the question. Now, this condition is a saving condition definitely for a valuer, but this condition is not really introduced for even investigation or inspection. So I think somewhere maybe this condition is a good condition, and that should be also introduced for the other proceedings which can be initiated. The order will become effective from after 30 days only. Now I missed out on this part about okay, I can leave that. Okay, so I will just take you through what are the minimum conditions which have to be there in the show cause notice, which is issued under section 40. And under this show cause notice, one has, first of all, it has to be in writing. It has to state the provision of the act under which it is issued, the details of the alleged fact, evidence and report of the alleged fact, provision of the act which is allegedly violated, action proposed to be taken, and time within which the submissions have to be made. So these are the basic parts which have to be complied with in a show cause notice. Now we come to the direction. So what kind of directions can a panel pass? It can give a warning, reprimand, improve capability. So I have made a chart over here which shows as to if the non-compliance is under first schedule, second schedule, then what comes. So improvement in capability is not there in the second schedule. Cease and desist, restriction on rendering valuation services, disgorgement of unlawful gain made or loss averted, monetary penalty which may extend up to 2 lakh or 10 lakh in case of first schedule, second schedule, or up to 3 times the amount of loss caused or likely to have been caused to the concerned user. whichever is higher. Now, this is a new condition. I think we have not seen the quantification of this size earlier in any law. There is also a monetary policy in case there is a gain which is made by the service provider, and that also can extend up to 3 times the amount of unlawful gain made by the service provider. Suspension of certificate of registration or COP, cancellation of, so this is. Now we come to appeals. So in case of appeal, now this is a very, one thing I want to really bring out to you here is that the appeal against the order of the panel will lie again to the ALM. Now the panels actually report to ALM, right? So this appeal will have to be to ALM, that is the administrative law member. It is to the same department which is actually passing the order. So one has to have some clarity on, whether this can be really done. If the service provider is approved by the order, sorry, then he can appeal to the ALM within 45 days. And again, ALM can also call for expert opinion to understand the issue, and there will be an order which will be passed within 90 days. Now, let us just look at what is the provision of appeal to High Court. So there is section 46 which says that there can be appeal to High Court, and what orders can be appealed to High Court. That is what I really want to bring out more clearly. The order which is passed under section 41(3) is something which can be appealed to the High Court, or order which is passed, I think, under section 49 or 50 can be also appealed to the High Court. So only these two orders are appealable. So that means that any other order which I talked about earlier, that if you have not complied with inspection, if you are in violation of, if it is construed that you have violated the conditions which are mentioned under inspection, then you can be fined, you can be imprisoned. Now that is an order which will be passed by the authority, and it will not be appealable to High Court because it is not passed under section 41. So we have to get some clarity on what are the, we have to get clarity, and we have to ensure that there is equitable justice to service providers. So that is, if anything is done, then he should have the right to appeal to a higher authority for anything. So there can be an order to confirm, modify, set aside, which can be passed by the High Court. Now, when there is an order to confirm, modify, set aside an order, then the opportunity has to be given to NIV. Then, if there is an order which enhances or imposes the penalty or reduces penalty, in that case, if there is an enhancement or imposition of penalty, in that case, the opportunity has to be provided to the service provider. Now, you can see this that under this, there is no requirement that opportunity has to be also provided to NIV, because under this, if there is a reduction of penalty, then opportunity has to be even provided to NIV, and irrespective of increase or reduction, there should be opportunity provided to both the parties when there is an appeal to High Court, because that is equitable in law. Okay, so this is about appeal to High Court. Now this is just one, I have reproduced the entire section here. It is very important to understand this section. It says no order passed by the panel or administrative law member under this act shall be appealable except as provided under section 43 or section 49 respectively, and no civil court shall have jurisdiction in respect of any matter which the institute, the panel or administrative law member is empowered by or under this act to pass any order, and no injunction shall be granted by any court or other authority in respect of any action taken or to be taken in pursuance of any order passed by the institute, panel or ALM under this act. So this is a very big, bar on appealing against any order which is passed by the panel or ALM or the NIV. So I think somewhere there has to be some dispensation, because otherwise this might really cast a lot of injustice to the service providers, because till the time it reaches the panel, he will not be able to, even file any writ or anything, or file for injunction before any higher authority or to any court. There's also, this is an interesting thing, that is settlement of contravention. So there's also a provision for settlement of contravention where the show cause notice is issued or is likely to be issued, or even if after it is issued at any time, the service provider can file an application in writing to NIV for settlement of the contravention, and the order of NIV under the settlement settlement provisions will not be appealable. Then we have penalties. I think I can skip this. I think I've already overshot the time. Only this one thing where the offences are not specifically provided for, then the punishment for contravention will be not less than 1 lakh, and which may extend to 2 crores. I can skip this, and I think I've covered this part earlier. So I think that's where we are. Yeah. Okay. So I think I have spoken enough, and there is a lot more, but I don't think there's enough time to cover everything. Over to
Thank you.
Anshul.
Yeah, thank you, CA Drashti Desai. I understand your challenge to comprise 179 pages into 60 itself is a very big challenge, and you have done it fantastically fine with all the minute details, section to section reading. In fact, participants has requested me that please share the PPT with us. So a big thank you. I would now request CA Hinal Shah, the committee member from the Women Empowerment Committee, to propose the formal vote of thanks. Hinal, over to you. Hinal, are you there? I think she's not there. I think there is some issue. Fine. On behalf of Ahmedabad branch of ICI, we are thankful to Drashti Desai. She is a regular faculty for Ahmedabad branch, especially women members. And I appreciate that even though she was busy with her valuation assignment, she finally accepted, because I was after her कि नहीं आपको तो लेना ही है. And as you all must have read that it's 179 pages. And thank you so much. We look forward for you for many more sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anshul. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. We'll have another seminar, dear members, at 4 o'clock for independent directors. See you there. Thank you all.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.